I didn't think I'd remember it this clearly. The way his mouth moved when he said it. The way the light from the street caught the side of his face, half gold, half shadow. The way I pretended not to feel anything shift inside me when the words left his lips. Jonah's words came with a crooked smile. I don't do serious. He said it like a warning, like something rehearsed, like if he delivered it with enough ease, I'd believe he meant it. Maybe I was supposed to. Maybe that's what people did when someone like Jonah showed up in their life. All charm and careful distance. All laughter that ended just before it became something real. You were supposed to take the warning and adjust accordingly. Protect yourself. Keep your expectations low. I laughed it off like I always did when Jonah built walls out of charm. Good thing I wasn't asking you to. But we both knew that wasn't true. I think we'd known for months. From the first time he showed up unannounced with takeout and stayed until 3 in the morning talking about nothing. From the nights he texted me when he couldn't sleep, like I was the only person in the world who might understand what it felt like to be awake at that hour, restless and unmoored. From the way his hand would linger on my shoulder when he said goodbye, just a second longer than it needed to. We were pretending. Both of us. Pretending this was casual. Pretending we didn't feel the weight of something unnamed growing between us every time we were in the same room. But that night, something changed. It was late. Later than it should have been for someone to show up without calling first. I heard the knock and knew, somehow, that it was him. I don't know how. Maybe I'd been waiting for it. Maybe some part of me had always been waiting. When I opened the door, he looked tired. Not physically, though there were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there the week before, but tired in a way that went deeper. Like he'd been carrying something heavy for too long and didn't know how to set it down. He didn't say much at first. Just came inside, shrugged off his jacket, sat on the edge of my couch like he wasn't sure he was allowed to stay. We talked. Small things. A movie he'd watched. A song I'd heard. The kind of conversation that fills space without saying anything at all. But I could feel it. The thing he wasn't saying. It sat between us like a third presence, invisible but undeniable. Then the laughter softened. The jokes trailed off. The room grew quieter, and the silence wasn't comfortable anymore. It was heavy, expectant. Jonah's voice changed. He looked at me, really looked at me. Eyes tired, mouth uncertain, like he was trying to decide whether to say something or let the moment pass and pretend he'd never thought it at all. He said quietly, almost too quietly, if I asked you to promise me something just tonight, could you? I didn't move. I didn't know what he was asking, but I knew it mattered. I knew that whatever came next would mean something, even if he never admitted it. I said, promise what? His throat moved. I watched him swallow, watched the hesitation flicker across his face. He looked like he wanted to take it back, like he wanted to laugh it off, make a joke, rebuild the wall before I could see what was on the other side. But he didn't. He said that you'll stay, and for the first time since I'd known him, Jonah didn't look like someone running from love. He looked like someone terrified of finding it. I felt something crack open inside me. Something I'd been keeping closed because it was easier that way. Safer. Because wanting someone like Jonah, someone who said he didn't do serious, someone who kept everyone at arm's length, someone who made you feel like you were the exception right up until the moment you realized you weren't. That was a risk I wasn't sure I could afford. But sitting there, looking at him in the low light of my living room, I realized I didn't care about the risk anymore. I realized I'd already fallen. Not in the way people fall in movies, with violins and declarations and certainty, but in the quiet, inevitable way you fall when someone becomes the person you think about first in the morning and last at night. When their voice is the one that calms you. When their presence feels like the only thing that makes sense in a world that mostly doesn't. I didn't say any of that. I didn't know how. I just looked at him, at the vulnerability written across his face like something he couldn't hide anymore. And I thought about all the nights he'd shown up. All the times he'd stayed just a little longer than he needed to. All the ways he'd let me in without ever admitting that's what he was doing. And I realized that maybe Jonah had been asking me to stay all along. Maybe he'd just been too afraid to say it out loud until now. The air between us felt fragile. Like if I moved too quickly or said the wrong thing, it would shatter, and we'd both pretend this conversation had never happened. We'd go back to laughing and pretending and keeping each other at a distance that felt safer than this. But I didn't want safe anymore. I wanted him, even if it was just for tonight. Even if tomorrow he'd rebuild the walls and tell me it didn't mean anything. Even if I was setting myself up for the kind of hurt that doesn't fade quickly. I wanted him. And I think, finally, he wanted to be wanted. I should tell you who I am. Who we were before that night made us into something different. My name is Reese. I'm 22, though sometimes I feel older than that. Not in a way that's visible. I don't have the kind of life experience that ages you prematurely, but in the way I move through the world. Carefully, deliberately, like I'm afraid that if I'm not paying attention, I'll miss something important. I've always been like this. The friend people call when they need someone to listen. The person who shows up when everyone else has stopped trying. I don't know if it's a strength or a weakness. This need to be steady for other people. Maybe it's both. I fall carefully but deeply. That's what my best friend told me once, after I spent 6 months getting over someone who never deserved that much of my time. You love like it's the only thing that matters, she said. Like if you just care enough, it'll somehow be enough for both of you. She was right. I do that. I give everything and hope it'll be returned, even when all the evidence suggests it won't be. I want connection, not confession. I want someone to know me without needing to perform for them. I want truth, not temporary. Not the kind of relationship that feels good in the moment, but dissolves the second real life intrudes. And maybe that's why Jonah terrified me from the beginning. Because he was everything I knew I shouldn't want. Jonah is 23, just a year older than me, but sometimes the distance feels wider than that. He carries himself like someone who's learned not to trust easy things. Like someone who's been hurt enough times that he's decided it's easier to hurt first. He's all sharp edges and late-night laughter. The kind of person who lights up a room when he walks into it, who makes strangers feel like they've known him for years, who can turn any moment into something electric just by being present. But underneath all that charm, there's something guarded. Something that keeps people close only long enough to make sure they can't hurt him. I saw it the first time we met, 6 months ago at a friend's birthday party. He was magnetic in the way beautiful people often are, but there was a careful distance in the way he interacted with everyone. Like he was performing the role of someone easygoing and available while keeping his real self locked away somewhere no one could reach. Most people didn't notice. They just saw the smile, heard the laugh, felt drawn to him without understanding why. But I noticed, maybe because I recognized it, the need to protect yourself, that fear of letting anyone see too much. We didn't talk that night. Not really. Just exchanged names, shared a few jokes in a group conversation, went our separate ways. But a week later, he texted me. One of our mutual friends had given him my number. He said he was bored and asked if I wanted to get coffee. I said yes. And somehow, over the next few months, we built something. Not a relationship. Neither of us ever called it that, but something unspoken. Something that existed in the spaces between friendship and more. Late-night drives where we talked about everything except what we were doing. Comfortable silences that felt intimate in a way words couldn't capture. Inside jokes that made us feel like we shared a language no one else understood. Jonah never asked for more. I never offered less. It felt safe that way. Like we'd found a middle ground where neither of us had to risk anything real. But under every shared joke, there was always a question. One neither of us dared to ask aloud. What if this could be something real? What if we stopped pretending we didn't feel it? What if we admitted that these late-night conversations meant something more than just killing time? I thought about it constantly. Every time he showed up unannounced. Every time his hand brushed mine and lingered just a second too long. Every time he looked at me like he was trying to figure out if I was safe enough to let in. I wanted to ask. Wanted to push past the careful distance we'd built and see what was underneath. But I was afraid. Afraid that if I named it, he'd run. Afraid that the thing we had, fragile and undefined as it was, would shatter the moment I tried to make it into something solid. So I stayed quiet. Let him set the pace. Let him come and go as he pleased, even when it hurt to watch him leave. I told myself it was enough. That having him in my life, in whatever capacity he'd allow, was better than not having him at all. I told myself I could handle the uncertainty. But the truth is I was already in too deep. And when he showed up that night, exhausted and vulnerable and asking me to promise him something, I realized that all the careful walls I'd built around my heart had been useless, because Jonah had already found his way inside. It started with Jonah showing up at my door after midnight. No warning, no text saying he was coming. Just 3 soft knocks that pulled me from the edge of sleep. When I opened the door, he was standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking like he'd been walking for a while. His hair was slightly disheveled, his jacket unzipped despite the cold. There was something different in his face, something I couldn't name. He said couldn't sleep, didn't want to be alone. I didn't ask why. I never asked why with Jonah. Questions felt like pressure, and pressure made him disappear. So I just stepped aside and let him in the way I always did. He moved through my apartment like he'd done it 100 times before, took off his jacket, sat on the couch, looked around at nothing in particular. I watched him from the doorway, try to read the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw kept tightening and releasing. I asked if he wanted anything. Water, tea, something stronger. He shook his head, just sat there, staring at his hands. I sat down beside him, leaving space between us. Enough space that it wouldn't feel like I was assuming anything. Enough space that he could breathe. We talked about nothing. Movies he'd been meaning to watch. Music I'd been listening to. The weather of all things. The kind of meaningless conversation that fills the silence without actually saying anything. But I could feel the weight of what he wasn't saying. It hung in the air between us, heavy and insistent. Jonah has always been good at talking around things, at filling space with words that don't mean anything, so he doesn't have to say the ones that do. I'd learned to listen for the spaces between his sentences, the moments where his voice changed, the pauses that lasted just a little too long. And that night, there were a lot of pauses. He'd start a sentence and trail off, laugh at something that wasn't funny, look at me, and then look away like he'd seen something that scared him. The conversation grew thinner, more fragile, until finally it stopped altogether. The silence stretched between us, and I didn't try to fill it. I just waited, let him sit with whatever he'd come here to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, different from the easy charm I was used to. He said, "I don't want to start anything." The words hit me harder than they should have, because I knew what he meant. I knew he was drawing a line before I could cross it, reminding me of the boundaries he'd built, making sure I understood that whatever this was, it couldn't be more than what we'd already agreed it would be. I nodded, pretending it didn't sting. Okay. My voice sounded steady, calm, like I wasn't bleeding inside. Jonah studied me. I felt his eyes on my face, searching for something. Maybe he was looking for hurt. Maybe he was looking for permission. Maybe he was looking for an excuse to leave before this went any further. His voice broke on the next word. But maybe just for tonight. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I was afraid that if I reacted too quickly, he'd take it back, that he'd laugh it off and pretend he hadn't just asked me for something that felt impossibly important. Just for tonight. I turned the words over in my mind, trying to understand what he was really asking. Was it permission? Was it a warning? Was it both? I looked at him, really looked at him, at the vulnerability written across his face, at the way his hands were trembling slightly, like he was afraid of what I might say, at the tension in his jaw that told me this was costing him something. And I realized that this was the bravest thing Jonah had ever done. Not the asking, but the admitting that he wanted something, that he needed something, that despite everything he'd said about not doing serious, about keeping things casual, about not letting anyone get too close, despite all of that, he was here, asking me to give him one night where he didn't have to pretend. I wanted to ask him what it meant, what he wanted from me, what would happen in the morning when the walls went back up and we had to pretend this hadn't changed everything. But I didn't ask any of those things, because I knew that if I pushed too hard, he'd disappear. And I wasn't ready for him to disappear. So, instead, I just looked at him, let him see that I understood, that I knew what he was really asking, that I was willing to give him this, even if it meant breaking my own heart in the process. I said softly, "What does just for tonight mean?" He exhaled, and it sounded like relief, like he'd been holding his breath, waiting for me to reject him. He said, "It means I stop pretending, just for a few hours. It means I let myself want this without thinking about what comes after." His eyes met mine, and they were so open, so unguarded, so completely unlike the version of Jonah I'd known for the past 6 months. He said, "It means I stop running. At least until morning. The hours stretched long and slow after that. Time moved differently, like we'd stepped into a space where the normal rules didn't apply, where morning was still far enough away that we could pretend it would never come. Jonah sat beside me on the couch, close enough that our knees touched, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, the tension radiating from his body despite the steadiness he was trying to project with his voice. His hands were trembling, just slightly, enough that I noticed when he reached up to run his fingers through his hair, enough that I understood how much this was costing him. He started talking, not about movies or music or nothing, but about real things, things that mattered. He told me about the fear of being known, about how every time someone got close enough to see past the charm and the laughter, they either wanted to fix him or they left, about how he learned that serious meant losing control, and losing control meant getting hurt. He said, "I've spent so long keeping people at a distance that I don't know how to do anything else. I don't know how to let someone in without panicking that they'll see something they don't like and decide I'm not worth the effort." His voice was quiet, raw, like he was pulling words from somewhere deep inside himself that he didn't usually let anyone access. I listened. I didn't interrupt, didn't try to reassure him or tell him he was wrong. I just listened, letting every word settle into the space between us. He told me about past relationships that had ended badly, about the person who'd told him he was too much work, about the one who'd said he was emotionally unavailable and probably always would be, about how he decided after that it was easier to keep things casual, to never promise anything, to make sure no one could accuse him of leading them on or breaking their heart. He said, "I tell people up front, I don't do serious. I don't do commitment. And most people are fine with that. They take what I'm offering and don't ask for more." He paused, and I felt him looking at me. He said, "But you never pushed. You never asked for anything." And somehow that made it worse. I turned to face him. "Worse how?" He exhaled slowly, "Because it made me want to give you things I didn't think I had to give." The words hung in the air between us, fragile and honest. I felt something shift, like a door opening that had been locked for so long neither of us remembered what was on the other side. Jonah's knee pressed harder against mine. His hands were still trembling, but he didn't pull away, didn't retreat into the safety of distance. He said, "I don't trust myself to want something this much. Every time I've wanted someone, I've found a way to ruin it. I get scared and I run, or I push them away before they can leave first. And I don't want to do that to you." His voice cracked on the last word. "I don't want to do that to you." I realized then that this wasn't just about tonight. It wasn't about one evening where he let his guard down and then went back to pretending in the morning. This was about something deeper, something he'd been carrying alone for so long that he didn't know how to share the weight of it. I said softly, "You're not going to ruin anything." He laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You don't know that." "You're right," I said. "I don't, but I'm still here." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before. Not just vulnerability, but hope. Terrifying, fragile hope. Then Jonah reached out. His fingers brushed my wrist, so lightly I almost thought I'd imagined it. But then they stayed there, resting against my pulse point, feeling my heartbeat. He said, "If I asked you to stay until morning, would you?" His voice was barely a whisper, like he was afraid that speaking any louder would shatter whatever spell we were under. I looked down at his hand on my wrist, at the way his fingers trembled even as they held on, at the way this simple touch felt more intimate than anything we'd shared before. I exhaled, and my voice came out barely audible. "Yeah, I'd stay." Something changed in his face. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something else. Relief, gratitude, maybe even joy. He didn't let go of my wrist. His thumb moved slightly, tracing a small circle against my skin. Such a small gesture, but it felt enormous. It felt like a promise he was too afraid to say out loud. We sat there like that, connected by this single point of contact. His hand on my wrist, my heart beating against his fingertips. The night stretching out around us like something we'd built together. And for the first time since he'd arrived, Jonah looked like he could breathe. Jonah's hand was still on my wrist when he looked up at me. His eyes were shining with something I couldn't quite name. Desperation, maybe, or fear, or maybe just the kind of raw honesty that feels dangerous when you're used to keeping everything hidden. He said, Don't make me promises you can't keep. The words came out rough, like they'd been scraped from somewhere deep inside him. Like he'd been holding on to them for a long time and couldn't carry them anymore. I felt my chest tighten, because I understood what he was really saying. That he'd heard promises before. That people had told him they'd stay, that they'd understand, that they wouldn't leave when things got difficult. And then they had. I answered softly, "You're the one asking for them." Jonah laughed once. It was sharp and broken, the kind of sound that isn't really about humor at all. "Yeah, guess I am." He looked down at where his fingers still rested against my pulse. His thumb had stopped moving. Everything had gone still, like we were both holding our breath. He said, "I don't know what I'm doing. I came here because I couldn't be alone tonight, and I told myself it was just that, just needing company. But that's not true." He paused, and I waited, gave him a space to find whatever words were trying to surface. He said, "I came here because you're the only person who makes me feel like I don't have to be anyone other than who I am. And that terrifies me, because the second I let myself need that, the second I let myself need you, I'm giving you the power to destroy me." His voice broke on the last word. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I would never hurt him, that he was safe with me. But I knew those were exactly the kind of promises he was afraid of, the kind that sounded true until they weren't. So instead I said, "I'm terrified too." He looked up sharply, like he hadn't expected that. I continued, "You think you're the only one who's scared? I've been falling for you for months, Jonah. And every time you showed up, every time you stayed a little longer, every time you looked at me like maybe I mattered, I fell a little further. And the whole time I knew you didn't want anything serious. I knew you'd never let this be more than what it was." My voice was shaking now. I could hear it, but I couldn't stop it. I said, "So don't act like you're the only one taking a risk here. Don't act like I'm somehow safe from this. Because I'm not. I stopped being safe the moment I let myself care about you." The silence that followed was heavy, profound, like something had been spoken into existence that couldn't be taken back. Jonah's grip on my wrist tightened. Not painfully, just enough that I could feel the intensity of whatever he was feeling translate into pressure against my skin. He whispered, "If this means something, I'll mess it up." The certainty in his voice broke my heart, because he believed it. He truly believed that he was incapable of having something real without destroying it. I shifted closer to him, close enough that I could feel his breath, close enough that when I pressed my forehead against his, our faces were almost touching. I said, voice shaking, "Then don't call it something. Just call it us." Jonah's breath hitched. His free hand came up slowly, hesitantly, until his fingers were touching my jaw. The contact was feather-light, uncertain, like he was afraid I might disappear if he held on too tightly. He said us. Just that one word. Testing it. Tasting it. Like it was something foreign and familiar at the same time. I nodded, my forehead still pressed to his. Us. Just for tonight. Just for right now. No promises about tomorrow. No expectations about what this becomes. Just us here being honest. When Jonah finally pulled me close, it wasn't about desire. Not in the way people usually mean. It was about something deeper, more fundamental. It was relief. The relief of being wanted, of being known, of being seen in all your jagged, broken pieces and having someone choose to stay anyway. His arms wrapped around me, and I felt him exhale against my shoulder. Felt the tension that had been holding him rigid finally start to release. We stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the dim light of my living room. Not kissing, not moving toward anything more, just existing in this moment of absolute honesty. Jonah's voice was muffled against my shoulder when he spoke again. "Just tonight." I nodded, even though we both knew it was a lie. Because this wasn't the kind of thing that ended when the sun came up. This wasn't the kind of connection you could walk away from and pretend hadn't fundamentally changed you. Just tonight, he'd said, but his arms were wrapped around me like he was holding on to something he'd been searching for his entire life. And I knew, even if neither of us could say it out loud, that tonight was already becoming something neither of us knew how to name. Something that felt both temporary and eternal. Something that felt like the beginning of everything. The night unfolded like something fragile and real. Like something we were building together out of silence and honesty and the kind of intimacy that doesn't require explanation. We moved from the couch eventually. Not in a rush. Not with urgency or heat. Just a slow migration toward comfort. Toward closeness. Toward the bedroom, where we could lie down and stop pretending that this was just two friends keeping each other company. Jonah followed me, his hand finding mine in the darkness. His fingers laced through mine, and the simple act of holding hands felt more significant than it should have. Like we were claiming something, acknowledging something. We lay down, facing each other. The room was dark except for the ambient light filtering through the curtains from the street outside. Enough light that I could see the outline of his face, the shadow of his features, the way he was looking at me, like he was trying to memorize this moment. His breathing was slow, deliberate, like he was trying to stay calm, even though I could feel the tension still present in his body. I reached out and touched his face, just my fingertips against his cheek. He closed his eyes at the contact, and I watched something in his expression soften. We didn't speak for a long time. We just existed there, in that space between wanting and having, between fear and surrender. When words finally came, they came from Jonah. Quiet, almost too quiet. He said, "If this means something, I'll mess it up." It wasn't the first time he'd said it, but hearing it again, here in the darkness, it sounded different, more honest, more afraid. I kept my hand against his face, let my thumb trace the line of his cheekbone. I said, "Then don't call it something. Just call it us." I'd said those words before too, but repetition didn't make them less true. If anything, it made them more solid, more real. Jonah opened his eyes. Even in the dim light, I could see the conflict there. The part of him that wanted to run, fighting against the part of him that wanted to stay. He said, "What if us is enough to break me?" My chest ached at the vulnerability in his voice, at the fear he was finally letting me see. I said, "What if us is enough to save you?" He exhaled shakily. I don't think I've ever been this scared. Me neither, I admitted, and it was true. I was terrified. Terrified that in the morning he'd regret this. Terrified that he'd rebuild the walls and I'd be left on the outside, knowing what it felt like to be let in and then shut out again. Terrified that I was giving him everything I had with no guarantee that it would be enough. But I was more terrified of not trying, of letting this moment pass and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to reach for it. Jonah moved closer, slowly, carefully, until there was barely any space left between us. He said, "I need you to understand something." I waited. He said, "I've never let anyone this close." Not really. I've had relationships, but I always kept part of myself locked away. Always had an exit strategy. Always made sure I could walk away without it destroying me. He paused, and his hand came up to rest against my chest, right over my heart. He said, "But with you, I don't have an exit strategy. I don't have walls that actually work. You got in without me even realizing it, and now I'm here, and I'm completely exposed, and I don't know how to protect myself anymore." His voice cracked. I don't even know if I want it. When he finally pulled me close, it wasn't about claiming or confessing. It wasn't about passion or heat or the physical expression of desire. It was about surrender, the kind of surrender that feels both temporary and eternal, the kind that acknowledges that this might hurt, that this might end badly, that this might be the thing that finally breaks you, but you're doing it anyway because the alternative is worse. His mouth found mine in the darkness. The kiss was soft, tentative, like he was asking a question with his lips that he didn't know how to voice. I answered by pulling him closer, by letting my hands map the terrain of his back, by showing him through touch what I couldn't adequately express in words. That I wanted this, that I wanted him, that I was willing to take the risk. We moved together slowly. There was no rush, no desperation, just the steady, inevitable pull of two people who'd been circling each other for months finally allowing themselves to collide. At one point, Jonah pulled back just enough to speak. His forehead rested against mine, his breath warm against my lips. He whispered, "If this means something, I'll mess it up." I pressed my forehead harder against this. My voice was shaking when I answered, "Then don't call it something. Just call it us." He nodded, just barely, just enough that I could feel the movement. And then he kissed me again, and there were no more words. Just us. Just this. Just the night stretching out around us like something we'd claimed together. just the feeling of being wanted and known, even if only until the sun came up. Morning spilled through the curtains in muted gold. Soft light that didn't demand anything. That just existed, gentle and inevitable, marking the end of the night we'd tried to make last forever. I felt Jonah wake before I opened my eyes. Felt the change in his breathing. Felt the way his body went from relaxed to tense in the span of a single moment. When I finally looked at him, he was staring at the ceiling. His expression was unreadable. Not closed off exactly, but guarded. Like he was already building the walls back up, brick by careful brick. I didn't say anything. Just watched him. Waited to see if he would run or stay. If the person who'd been so vulnerable in the darkness would still exist in the light of day. His jaw tightened. Released. Tightened again. I could see him thinking. Could practically hear the thoughts racing through his mind. All the reasons this was a mistake. All the ways this complicated everything. All the fears he'd confessed in the darkness coming back to claim him. I wanted to reach out. To touch him. To remind him that it was still us. Still the same two people who'd held each other through the night. But I didn't. Because I knew that whatever happened next had to be his choice. I couldn't make him stay. Couldn't make him want this in the morning the way he'd wanted it at midnight. Minutes passed. Long, heavy minutes where neither of us spoke. Then I stirred beside him. Not deliberately. Just the natural movement of someone waking up. I murmured something soft. Something I don't even remember now. Something that was just sound and warmth and the remnants of sleep. But I know Jonah heard it. I know he'll remember it for the rest of his life. Even if he never tells me what it was. Because something in his face changed. Just slightly. Just enough. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. Raw from sleep and emotion and everything we'd shared in the hours before dawn. He said, I said I didn't want anything serious. The words landed between us like stones. Heavy. Final. I nodded. Kept my expression neutral, even though my heart was breaking. You didn't get serious. You got honest. Jonah turned his head to look at me then. Really look at me. And I saw everything in his eyes. The fear, the longing, the desperate want to believe that this could be different. That he could be different. He said same thing. And he smiled. Faintly. Like it hurt. I understood what he meant. That for someone like Jonah, honesty was serious. Vulnerability was commitment. Letting someone see the real him, the unguarded him, the him that was terrified and hopeful and breakable. That was the most serious thing he could offer. He didn't ask me to stay again. Didn't say anything about what came next or what this meant or whether we'd ever have another night like this one. But when I finally moved to get up, when I shifted toward the edge of the bed like I was preparing to leave and give him space to process whatever he was feeling, Jonah reached out. His fingers brushed my wrist. The same wrist he'd touched the night before. The same place where he'd felt my pulse and asked me to promise him something. He didn't grab. Didn't pull. Just touched. Just held. For a moment. For several moments. Long enough that it became something more than casual contact. Long enough to make another promise neither of us would say out loud. His thumb traced a small circle against my skin, and I felt it like an anchor. Like a tether. Like something that connected last night to this morning and this morning to whatever came after. I looked down at his hand. At the way his fingers trembled slightly even as they held on. Then I looked at his face. At the conflict still written there. At the fear that hadn't disappeared in the daylight. But underneath the fear, there is something else. Something tentative and fragile, but undeniably present. Hope. I said quietly, I'm not going anywhere. Jonah's grip on my wrist tightened. Just barely. Just enough. He said, just tonight. But his voice didn't sound convinced anymore. Didn't sound like someone stating a fact. It sounded like someone repeating words that had already stopped being true. I nodded anyway. Just tonight. We both knew we were lying. We both knew that what we'd built in the darkness couldn't be contained to a single night. That it had already spread beyond the boundaries we tried to set. That it meant something. That we meant something. Jonah's hand stayed on my wrist. Holding. Connecting. Promising without words what he wasn't ready to promise out loud. And in that moment, I understood that this was how love worked for people like us. People who'd been hurt. People who'd learned to protect themselves. People who were terrified of wanting too much. It didn't come with grand declarations or certainties. It came in small gestures. in trembling hands that held on anyway, in promises made through touch instead of words. Just a night, we'd said, but his fingers were still wrapped around my wrist like he was holding on to something precious, like he was holding on to forever. And maybe, quietly, impossibly, that's exactly what this was.